What does it mean to be told that your faith makes you unfit to serve the public? In Quebec, Bill 21, officially now known as Law 21, is known as the act respecting the laicity of the state, which means the prohibition regarding certain public sector workers from wearing visible religious symbols while on the job. That includes teachers, lawyers, police officers, and judges.
So Bill 21, in our view, is an unconstitutional and discriminatory legislation that affects, predominantly religious minority communities, and in particular, Muslim women and Muslim communities, but also, Sikh communities, Jewish communities, and other religious minority communities. But it predominantly impacts communities with visual religious symbols.
That was the director of the Equality Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, or the CCLA, Harini. Harini has been deeply involved in advocacy surrounding equality rights, constitutional protections, and the legal implications of Bill 21. At the center of this debate is a fundamental question. Can a government claim neutrality while restricting people from participating fully in public life because of a visible expression of faith? Through litigation, advocacy, and public education, CCLA has challenged Bill 21 not only as a Quebec issue, but as a national conversation about the future of minority rights and constitutional protections in Canada.
The reason why CCLA partnered with the National Council for Canadian Muslims and Madame Hack, who at the time was a teacher's candidate, who was looking at, I wear a hijab, I'm a Muslim woman. If this bill passes, I will not have an opportunity to practice my profession, my chosen profession, and stay true to my faith and my beliefs, because she wears a hijab, right? And she believes that that is important for her identity. So that is why we partnered, because of that choice, right? Of having to choose between your vocation, your passion, your profession, and your faith, and expressing your faith to what you believe to be, representative of how you want to practice your faith.
Supporters of this law call it secularism, critics call it discrimination. But beyond the legal debates and political talking points are real people. Individuals forced to choose between their careers, their identities, and their place within society. For many Muslim women, particularly those who wear the hijab, Bill 21 has become more than legislation. It has become a message about who is permitted to belong in public life. Today's episode explores the legal, political, and human impact of Bill 21 and the broader fight over religious freedom, equality rights, and belonging in Canada. I'm Hannan Mohamud, and this is Injustice and Insight.
So Bill 21, which is Law 21 now, is a very, very restrictive bill. It's under the guise of secularism. And it started, or this affair started in 2013 with the PQ government and Madame Pauline Marois drafting her Charte de Valeur.
That was Shaheen Ashraf, a board member with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, an organization that has long advocated for Muslim women's rights, equity, safety, and civic participation across Canada.
And I've been fighting this term secularism ever since that year. A while ago, Monsieur Legault started, piggybacking on that Charte de Valeur, and I think this Bill 21 was proposed, and then it was passed in a very, very suspicious way, because it was passed at around midnight, like after 10:30 at night or something. No, none of us were consulted how we felt about it. Because mostly it impacts Muslim women who wear the scarf, and the Muslim women are feeling like second-class citizens now.
For many Canadians, the law has also raised urgent questions about the limits of charter protections, the use of the notwithstanding clause, and what happens when governments override fundamental rights in the name of public policy.
I think it's important to look at this types of movements and the incremental nature of secularism and the targeting of particular religious communities. So if you fast forward to a few years before Bill 21 was passed, we had a niqab ban, right, that was found to be unconstitutional. The court said this clearly is discriminatory. And then what happened was that this is why when Quebec government passed Bill 21, they invoked the notwithstanding clause.
We can appreciate that the climate of danger that is surrounding us in Quebec is now more pronounced than in 2017.
That was CCMW board member Samaa, based in Montreal and the president of the Quebec chapter of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. In her writing, Samaa argues that Islamophobia cannot be separated from the political narratives and media environments that shape public fear. She points to the ways Muslim women and Muslims in general have repeatedly been framed through the language of security, extremism, and threat, narratives that became especially amplified during the rise of right-wing populism internationally.
When I was researching my article, I found the following, that in the video footage of Alexandre Bissonnette, the attacker, he told the police that his violent action was triggered in part by news covering of the U.S. travel ban introduced by Donald Trump in January 2017. So let's recall this executive order that Trump passed was to pause entry into the United States for citizens of several majority Muslim countries. We can recall it was for Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. And he also halted Syrian refugees' resettlement indefinitely. Now, how did this impact Canada? Bissonnette also said that he saw the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, respond publicly, even with Twitter, by saying that Canada would welcome refugees, quote, regardless of faith. So this for Bissonnette apparently was the final straw. He believed that allowing more refugees into Canada would increase the threat of terrorism and that Muslims would come and harm his family. So this he said in his defense. Now, if we analyze the climate, the political climate today, it's not different than during the first term of Donald Trump. I would say it's even worse. So being so close to the US, this is having a great impact on Canadian, I would say, rhetoric, imaginary, whether it's among the media, politicians, the public. So that's why I think our concern is really real.
One of the themes emerging from this episode is that many Muslim communities in Quebec do not feel safer today than they did several years ago. In some ways, community advocates argue that the climate has become even more dangerous.
So Bill 21 infringes on religious freedoms of individuals who work in or want to work in the public sector by prohibiting them from wearing religious symbols such as crosses, hijabs, turbans, and yarmulkes. This is, as I said, a discriminatory law, and it impacts a wide range of employees, including teachers, police officers, lawyers who want to work for the government, etc. And the harms that stem from Bill 21 have been well documented. So this law was passed in 2019. After 5 years, there's a sunset clause for the use of the notwithstanding clause, and it needs to be repassed again. And after 5 years, it was reintroduced and renewed the notwithstanding clause. So that means that over 6 years, this harmful discriminatory law has been impacting not just people in the professions, but also young people who aspire to be in those professions. It's had a detrimental impact on predominantly Muslim women, Sikhs, Jews, as well as racialized and newcomer communities. And so not just trying to shut out career options for individuals, but the other broader impacts of Bill 21, besides just, restricting career options for individuals, is that this bill has created a toxic environment in Quebec that has impacted the safety, security, well-being, belongingness of members of religious minority communities, specifically Muslim communities. We've heard reports of a decline in safety in public spaces, the hindering of participation in social and political activities, and a curtailment of freedom of expression. So like a chilling impact that Bill 21 has had over the past since it was introduced and passed into law. And many members of visible religious minority communities have also experienced incidences of physical and verbal threats, as well as acts of violence. So, this is about people's participation in their chosen profession, but it's also wider than that because of the sense of exclusion that this bill sends to members of religious minority communities.
Just this morning, we had the news that there has been demonstrations in front of some major Quebec mosques.
At the time of this recording in January 2026, Muslim organizations and community leaders were once again raising alarms following demonstrations and tensions outside several Quebec mosques during the January 29 National Day of Remembrance and Action Against Islamophobia, also known to many communities as Green Square Day. For many Muslims in Quebec, these incidents are not viewed as isolated moments. They are understood within a broader climate where anti-immigrant rhetoric, suspicions towards visible Muslims, and debates around belonging have increasingly entered mainstream political discourse.
We don't have the details yet, but apparently I was wondering what kind of demonstrations. And those are proponents, supporters of Bissonnette. So they were celebrating the act of terror of Bissonnette rather than decrying it. And this is in contrast to what we have seen in 2017 when the whole of Quebec was in shock. Everybody was asking, how could this happen here? And there was a great sympathy for the Muslim community. Of course, this didn't last, but now on the anniversary of the attack, we're seeing demonstrations for Bissonnette. This is really worse.
Many scholars and advocates trace the current political climate surrounding anti-Muslim hate to broader post-9/11 narratives that linked Muslim identity with terrorism in public consciousness. But the normalization of these ideas accelerated significantly during the political rise of Donald Trump in the United States. Policies like the so-called Muslim travel ban, combined with rhetoric around radical Islamic terrorism, legitimized the idea that Muslims as a group represented a security concern rather than distinguishing between extremists and the broader Muslim population. Community advocates argue these narratives did not stop at the American border. Similar anxieties around immigration, secularism, nationalism, and identity increasingly entered political debates in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada. Critics say that this environment created fertile grounds for policies like Bill 21 and reinforced public suspicion towards visible Muslims, particularly Muslim women. Before we continue, Harini from the CCLA is going to give us a quick, brief history of the notwithstanding clause, what it is, why it exists within the Charter framework, and why its use in Bill 21 has become such a defining constitutional issue in Canada.
The origins of the notwithstanding clause originate in Quebec politics as well. So when the Constitution was being repatriated, 1982, that's when the Charter was born, and we realized we need a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that is constitutionally protects our rights and freedom. However, in doing that, in order to get some provinces like Quebec to sign on to the Constitution and the Charter, there was a provision called the Notwithstanding Clause, Section 33 of the Charter, that was added that would allow governments to override Charter rights and be able to preserve their legislative authority. So it really comes down to a little bit of politicking, of the issue being that, some provinces were afraid of losing their provincial autonomy to pass legislation that could be overridden by courts. So in order to get that, buy-in from some provinces, the notwithstanding clause was added to be able to encourage all the other the provinces to sign on to the Charter. However, I think what's important is at the time that the notwithstanding clause was debated and included into the Charter, it was seen as not it was seen politically as not being used often and being only used in rare and exceptional circumstances where, overrides, important charter rights, and then the government can, pass the law and say that, that decision shouldn't, despite the violation of a charter right, that this law should still apply. So just to sum up, the notwithstanding clause was seen as not being used often. However, almost immediately after the charter was signed and repatriated and came into force, we see that Quebec government has used it on an omnibus fashion to pass all of its laws, but that was more as a protest versus actually wanting to substantively use the notwithstanding clause. It was more seen as a protest of the Constitution being signed without its full participation. So a lot of politics happened there. And then now we have fast forward, 30, 40 years later, and we're seeing an increasing use of the notwithstanding clause, not just by Quebec, but by other provinces, to increasingly override and try to infringe rights and freedom of various minority communities. Yeah, so this challenge is, well, first of all, it's important because it affects the minority community. Like when anybody's rights are under attack, everyone should be, in solidarity standing up. But and that's the other issue is that when rights and freedoms are being chipped away, certain community groups that are most vulnerable and marginalized are often the first to be targeted. So in the example of Bill 21, it's predominantly impacting Muslim communities, specifically Muslim women, who are among a very marginalized population in Quebec society, but also Canadian society. We can see that's also happening in Saskatchewan and Alberta, where those provincial governments have used the notwithstanding clause to infringe the rights of trans and gender diverse students in those provinces by stripping away their rights. And so who is next, right? What is the next province that's going to strip away rights and freedoms for another marginalized and vulnerable community group? So I think just to sum up, when you start to chip away at our rights and freedoms that are supposed to cover everyone, right? Every provision of the charter starts with everyone has, right? It's similar to the we the people in the US context, right? Is everyone created equal? Do rights apply equally to everyone? And I think that's the core of this issue. And that's why people outside of Quebec, even though this is a case about a Quebec law that predominantly targets Muslim communities and other religious minorities, particularly women, everyone should be concerned, even if you don't practice that faith, if you don't belong to those communities, because an erosion of one group's rights and freedoms is an erosion for all of our rights and freedoms, because, what could be next? It could be freedom of speech that could be targeted next, and the notwithstanding clause could be used to, infringe protest rights, freedom of speech, labor. We're seeing the notwithstanding clause being used in Alberta on a teacher strike. So, all of these core rights and freedoms are at stake if we just let this go unchecked and not have a strong court decision that says, no, there needs to be some parameters on the use of the notwithstanding clause to strip away our rights and freedom.
The debate raises broader questions about how easily governments can sidestep constitutional protections that protect our rights and freedoms, particularly during moments where minority communities are already facing heightened public hostility.
And so the notwithstanding clause is a section of the charter that allows a law to operate notwithstanding, so in spite of the law violating specific charter rights. And so this added a different element to the challenge, that in addition to wanting to preserve rights and freedom, the use of the notwithstanding clause was also a very important part of this case that we wanted to fight against, right?
One of the central tensions in the debate around Law 21 is the difference between neutrality and exclusion. Proponents of the law argue that a secular state must appear religiously neutral, but critics ask an important question: can a state truly claim neutrality when the burden of that neutrality falls disproportionately on certain communities?
Some people choose to wear hijab, or some religious coverings and symbols. Others choose not to. And that choice is really important and needs to be preserved. So bringing that or linking that to secularism, this bill purports to state neutrality when it concerns religion. However, I think it's really important to look at, this isn't an actual neutral law, right? It does disproportionately impact specific religious minority communities.
If you are a public servant, or if you are visibly like in a teacher's role, or a daycare worker's role, so mostly the roles that Muslim women take, but lawyers and police officers are also, they also come under that. And what I need to tell people is that my scarf is part of my wardrobe. It's not, it's something that I believe in, it's my practice. And taking that away from me really hurts.
And so that's the textbook definition of, an equality claim, where you have a law that, appears to be neutral on its face, but the effect and the impact of that law disproportionately impacts and targets particular populations. So what I want to what I wanted to focus on is that what this case is ultimately about is whose rights are being protected, and can our rights and freedom just be taken away by invoking the notwithstanding clause? And if that's the case, is that the kind of country that we want Canada to be? And is that the type of society that we want our children to grow up in?
For many visibly Muslim women, neutrality has translated into exclusion from classrooms, courtrooms, and public institutions. And beyond Quebec, the debate has forced Canadians to confront broader questions about multiculturalism, constitutional protections, and the fragility of minority rights when public opinion shifts. This conversation is not only about one province or one law, it is also about the kind of country Canada aspires to be.
And what's deeply troubling to me is the message of exclusion it sends to young people. A lot of, we tell our children, you can be anything you want to be when you grow up. I have 2 daughters, and I tell them, the world is your oyster. You can grow up to be whatever you want. So children of religious faith in Quebec don't have that option. They can't be anything they want because there's certain professions that are excluded from them. They have to choose then between the profession that they want to be when they grow up, or expressing their religious faith. And so that to me is so heartbreaking that, these young people are growing up in this society where they feel excluded, their options are limited, and they're facing, increased harassment, discrimination from these policies.
I've been living in Canada for almost 50 years. And when I came here in 1976, I didn't feel left out. I was included in everything. I was participating in society. And it didn't matter to anyone how I dressed, because they were more concerned about my service to the community. Okay. And so I was volunteering, and I was joining organizations, sitting on boards but, politics was really not my domain. Okay. But I noticed that it started affecting me. Okay. And I was not impacted personally because I had my own business, but I have heard horror stories from people who were impacted by these laws. I would call them discriminatory laws.
So the other thing that Bill 21 has been doing, or the other impact of Bill 21, is that it's driving talented, high-skilled, folks out of the province because they have to choose between, their professions and their faith. And this is in a time where, we have labor shortages in key industries, and this law is driving people that are very talented and skilled out of the province so that they can actually, practice their chosen profession and be true to the faith that they believe in.
Well, I'm originally from Egypt, and I have been here in Montreal for over 50 years. And I came with the dream that I would be living in a free country where human rights are respected, and also in a country where you would be free to voice your political opinions. I always had political opinions. So I got involved with the CCMW, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, since the very beginning, its inception here in Montreal in the mid 80s. And I just continued my work. I'm more politically oriented, so I have had a radio program for the Arab Muslim community, which was very popular after the 9/11. I really found my voice, I found my vocation there. I love to do radio. So I did this for 11 years. Recently, after the attacks in Gaza, after October 7, 2023, I got back into radio, but this is more on the political side. And I must say, Hannan, that I'm so disappointed to see how the leaders have almost lost their humanity. I mean, Gaza was a big blow. It was a wake up call. When I first to Canada, I was insensitive to the plight of the indigenous people, or at least, when you come to a new country, you're hopeful. You don't want to see the negative parts. And now I'm forced to look into it. And I would say, yes, those who told me that Canada is not such a country aligned with human rights, look what they did to the indigenous people, say they were right. As I was naive, so I wouldn't say I lost my innocence, but this is the situation. I'm so disappointed. What gives me hope is the young people.
In this time right now where we're seeing, a rise of authoritarianism, we're seeing, a decline in democracy, and Canada and Canadian Charter, like Canada has issues. We have a lot of human rights issues. We have a history of discrimination and racist immigration policies. And we have a history of colonialism and a horrible history of our treatment of Indigenous people. So we are not, we have the gold, like we're not the gold standard on human rights by far, but we do have a very, a great charter of rights and freedoms that we need to aspire to, right? And not undermine. So especially during this time right now where rule of law is under threat. And another value of Canada is our multiculturalism and our diversity. Again, pointing out that we do have a history of racist, exclusionary immigration policies, and it's still like not just a history, but also a present of these types of restrictive immigration and, policies. So we still have this sense of a diverse community with multiculturalism, that we, are not that melting pot where you can just, that you have to forego your cultural identity and your background, but you can be Canadian and you can be and carry your cultural identity with you. Those kind of values are something that we need to continue to fight for and preserve, as, those are being undermined by these types of laws. I think what's really important is connecting this to kind of the immigration story, is that a lot of people came to Canada because they were facing religious oppression, rights violations, political suppression of their political freedoms and expression in their home countries. And then they're coming to Canada with this expectation that, rights and freedoms are guaranteed. And then they face, some of these laws, and there's like a sense of almost, disillusionment that, we fought all of these back home and we thought here in Canada, we're going to have our rights and freedoms protected. So it's really, I think that's a connection I also wanted to make, is that a lot of communities, came from countries and they chose Canada because of the values of equality and justice and freedom that are enshrined in our Charter of Rights and Freedom.
One of the reoccurring concerns raised by advocates is the role political rhetoric plays in reinforcing public bias against immigrants and minority communities. When politicians repeatedly frame immigration as a threat to identity, security, or social cohesion, those narratives can shape public attitudes far beyond election cycles. Critics argue that the language around protecting values, defending secularism, or preserving culture often becomes coded language that disproportionately targets racialized and Muslim communities. These conversations have intensified in Quebec politics in recent years, particularly amid debates surrounding identity, language, religion, and immigration.
I see it's the political climate, whether it's nationally here in Quebec or internationally, especially that now we're going to be heading into a year of elections, whether on the maybe federal, but for sure provincial, on the Quebec level, I would say. So this nationalism appeals to a certain, I would say, clientele, certain voters. So politicians would always want to reinforce the question of we, Québécois de souche, against the immigrants. And no matter how long we've been in Quebec, we're always considered as immigrants. So we are the others. And of course, the media has this depiction of Muslim men as being a threat, as terrorists. And when it comes to women, it's women who wants to take us back to the Stone Age, and they're covering themselves and so on. And this is so contrary to our quote unquote Quebec values of equality and progress. So all this is playing on the minds of the popular, opinion about Muslims, and it's constantly reinforced by repetitive media coverage for those racial, I would say, tropes.
This conversation is unfolding amid ongoing political tensions in Quebec, including the recent resignation of Legault, which has further intensified public debate around political accountability, governance, and the direction of identity-based politics in the province. For many observers, moments like these highlight how rapidly political discourse can shift and how minority communities often experience the consequences of that rhetoric long before broader society recognizes that harm.
Well, his resignation tells us that the constituents, the citizens, they are seeking change. Okay, and his unpopularity was bringing the party down, and I think he's trying to save the party by resigning. But uh, this really will not affect the way that the party is going, because under the guise of secularism, it's really difficult for Muslim women to find jobs, and the jobs that they like,
What it means for the Muslim community, unfortunately, I don't see any change, because although it is expected that the CAC, the party of Mr. Legault, will not be in the government during the next elections because they're not losing popularity. But what are the alternatives? The fact remains that no matter all parties running are going to play on this idea of nationalism, and we are protecting Quebec values. So we go back to the same narrative. I don't see any change. Now, let's say that, we're not going to cry over the departure of Mr. Legault or his party, but what is coming next? Maybe the Parti Québécois. And as far as Muslims are concerned, it is not going to be better for our community.
Yeah, so I think this is something I've learned through a lot of my public interest advocacy, is that even if you do win in courts, and the legal victories are important, it's translating those legal victories into material realities that is, the hardest part of advocacy. And so with this case specifically, I mean, a legal victory would be huge, right? But I think in order to get that, especially in political climates, we need support. We need political engagement, because oftentimes the law, as much as it could be on your side, we need that public engagement to know why these rights are important, what the impact they are going to have on our communities, on our families, in our schools. I think having that knowledge and being able to engage with political decision makers, with our friends, our neighbors. I think the biggest advocacy and the most important advocacy is just talking to our neighbors, talking to people in our community, explaining to them this is why, you may not know, maybe you've never seen somebody with a religious symbol. And this is why this is important to me. This is, humanizing, the narratives, and changing that. Like, I think that pushes the needle forward. It's just that human connections, right? So the most effective thing that we can do is just talk to each other, in respectful ways, and just engage in dialogue to be able to have a better understanding of the impact of these laws have on our fellow community members. We're all neighbors. We all have to live in a society together. And I think that's the best way to move the needle forward. It's just to talk to people in your, if you're in a parent teacher council, talk to other parents, right? About why this religious symbol, what does it mean? Why is it important to you? Why is it important to your family? Why is it important to pass that knowledge on to your children? Those are all really important things that I think everyone can do and play. The other important political engagement or public engagement is talking to policymakers and decision makers. So ultimately, it is the legislature that passes these laws. And if we can put enough political pressure to show that we do not want the notwithstanding clause to be used to violate anyone's right, the more strongly we can send that message, the less likely governments will resort to using the notwithstanding clause to strip away our rights and freedoms.
I do this work because I feel it is important. I am a representative. I wear several hats. I'm a Muslim woman. I'm a hijab-wearing Muslim woman. I am an important part of the society because I joined several organizations to help me integrate into society, to help other women integrate into society. So I'm passionate about my volunteer work that I do, and I feel that I will make a difference. I like to make people aware that get to know us, because there is this fear factor that if you don't know somebody, you get kind of the otherness, but once, and this is the reason why I always I'm the first to stretch out my hand in friendship to whoever I see when I'm out in the community, whether it's black people, white people, Muslims, non-Muslims, believers, non-believers, because we're all human beings. There is a connection, there is a humanity connection between people. So I try my best.
There's a series of new laws that have been passed and introduced in the Quebec National Legislative Assembly, and these laws are expanding the very harmful provisions of Bill 21. So there's some laws that are expanding Bill 21's religious symbols ban to other workers in education, daycare workers and other sectors. We have other laws that are going beyond that and applying some of these religious symbols bans to students. And to private schools, and it's just it's that incremental erosion of rights, and it's very, very disheartening that the Quebec government has chosen to introduce and pass these laws while Bill 21 is still being considered by the Supreme Court of Canada. I think it says a lot about what desperate the Quebec government is in this moment in time. Other measures in these laws are eroding the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? Trying to erode rights that will impact not just religious communities, but everyone by undermining the human rights in the Quebec Charter, as well as accommodations and being able to seek religious accommodations in universities and post-secondary education institutes, as well as high schools, elementary schools, private schools, by really undermining the accommodation system and accommodation framework that has been working. And I think that's the other issue here, is that accommodations and the accommodations framework has been working. It's been able to, through a human rights lens, we've been able to accommodate religious differences and needs very well in a very, cohesive society. What these types of bills and laws that are being introduced and passed, they actually undermine and erode that cohesion in society, and is creating a lot of the problems that they're trying to then fix, right? So yeah, like I'm sorry, I can go on about that, but basically, these new laws are just incrementally expanding the scope of Bill 21, and it's very harmful, and it is sending a message of exclusion to religious minority communities, but especially to Muslim communities in Quebec.
Well, the Canadian government, the federal government, has introduced January 29 as a day of remembrance, and we also have Mrs. Amira El-Gawabi, who's the federal representative for combating Islamophobia. But as I mentioned in my article, this is necessary. So this is a first step, but it's not sufficient. We haven't seen any progress on the ground. And admittedly, also the challenges are great. I mean, the forces working for Islamophobia are just too strong. And that's why we have Muslim Awareness Week. We do what we can do, but it's almost an everyday struggle. It's not going to be a week or a month that will make the difference. It's going to be every day. We feel that we're going against the current, and we have to be very strong and look at the future. But this is really fighting for our lives at this point.
So where it's going, I'm hoping that the new government will help us integrate more into society and accept us as we are.
I think it's super courageous of Madame Hack and all of the folks that are impacted by this law to challenge it, and the community groups that have stood up. One thing that might be really interesting is that we have a record number of interveners in the Bill 21 case, and it's a 5-day hearing, multiple parties. This is it's a case, and I think it's so great that so many public interest organizations want to intervene in this case and have a say. And I think it's a testament to how important this case is, not just to Quebec, not just to the Muslim community, but to all of Canada and everyone who does value rights and freedoms and equality and justice. I think it sends a strong testament to that, and that there's so many people that have the community's backs on this, and are strong allies in that fight. But this fight belongs to and is led by the communities that are most impacted, and it's courageous, and it's been a privilege to work with these communities.
Law 21 continues to shape lives, careers, and conversations across Canada. For some, it represents a defense of secularism. For others, it represents the normalization of exclusion under the language of neutrality. But regardless of where people stand politically, the law forces an important national conversation: who gets to participate fully in public life without compromising who they are. Today's discussion reminds us that constitutional debates are never purely theoretical. They are lived every day by people navigating faith, identity, work, and belonging. And as legal challenges continue and public discourse evolves, the questions raised by Bill 21 remain far from settled. This has been Injustice and Insight. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Hannan Mohamud. Until our next episode.